Ilara did not cry when they took her away from everything she had built. She stood in the center of the great hall with her hands pressed flat against her sides, her chin level, her jaw tight with the effort of keeping it that way, and her eyes completely dry, while 300 people stared at her, as though she were the one who had done something wrong. She had not done anything wrong. She had simply existed. She had simply been born with the same face as her sister, and on this particular evening, in this particular hall, that face had become a problem for a man with too much ambition and far too little conscience to carry it responsibly. The hall had been planned for weeks. Long tables covered in deep green cloth ran from one end of the room to the other. Iron candle holders stood at every stone column. Thick garlands of white flowers hung from the rafters in careful loops that a decorator had spent 2 days arranging to look effortless. The people of 3 packs had gathered here tonight for a ceremony that was supposed to celebrate the beginning of something good. A union between packs was meant to represent peace, loyalty, and the kind of trust that came from choosing one another freely in front of witnesses. The Elder Council had spent months arranging the details. The food was still warm on the tables. Every glass in the room was still full. Nobody was eating. Nobody was drinking. Every person in the hall was looking at Ilara. Her name was Ilara Voss. She was 24 years old. She had worked as a healer in the Ashwood Pack's medical hall since she was 17 years old, when she first discovered that her hands had the ability to bring down a fever that had gone too high, and that her voice, kept steady and low in a frightened person's ear, could bring a racing heart back down to something manageable. She was not the loudest person in any room she walked into. She was not the most immediately striking, or the most dramatic, but people who took the time to pay careful attention to her often said afterward that there was something in her face that stayed with them long after they had gone home and gone on with their lives. A kind of quiet depth, a stillness that was not passivity, but its opposite, the stillness of someone who was paying attention to everything. Her twin sister, Celine, had always been the one people noticed first and remembered loudest. Celine was everything Ilara was, but every quality had been turned up higher and made more visible. Her laugh landed in a room before the joke did. Her smile was the kind that made the recipient feel personally chosen by it. She entered spaces the way certain people do, as though she had been expected, and everyone had been waiting without knowing it. Celine had always been the twin who collected attention the way others collected ordinary things, naturally, and without seeming to try. Ilara had always been the twin who sat slightly to the left at every gathering, who watched and listened and understood situations 3 steps before anyone thought to explain them. She had never been genuinely bitter about this. She had examined the question, more than once, with the honesty she applied to everything, and she had not found bitterness underneath. She loved Celine the way people love the constants of their lives, completely and without needing a reason, with a depth that went back further than memory, to a shared beginning, so early and so complete that it had become part of her body, rather than simply part of her heart. The love between twins was a particular kind of love. It carried something that ordinary love did not carry. 24 years of shared mornings and private shorthand, and the specific, irreplaceable comfort of being known from the very beginning, by someone who had been there for all of it, which made tonight something that she was going to need all of her steadiness to hold. The ceremony had begun at sundown. Ilara had stood with the crowd on the left side of the great hall, wearing the pale gray dress her mother had carefully pressed that morning, and she had watched Damien Cole walk to the center of the room, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life been made to wait for anything he wanted. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, with dark eyes set in a face that looked as though it had been carved from something that did not soften easily, and he moved through spaces with the particular ease of someone accustomed to rooms adjusting themselves around him. Damien Cole was the beta of the Coldwater Pack. He was powerful, and he was organized, and he was, by any practical measure, a reasonable match for a woman of Celine's standing in the pack hierarchy. He had been formally courting Celine for 6 weeks. There had been arranged meetings and dinners, and carefully observed afternoons, coordinated between the elder councils of both packs. It had looked, from a distance, like something genuine. It had looked like the beginning of something that might matter to both of them. The claiming ceremony was the formal final step. It was the moment when a male officially named his chosen in front of witnesses. He would say Celine's name. He would place the ceremonial mark on her wrist. The elders would record it. Then the celebration would begin in earnest. The food would be eaten, and the wine would be drunk, and everyone would go home satisfied that two packs had drawn closer together through an act of genuine choosing. Damien Cole walked to the center of the hall. 300 people went quiet. He looked at Celine. Celine smiled at him, the warm and practiced smile she had spent 24 years refining, until it landed exactly where she aimed it every time. She was wearing a deep red dress that suited her precisely, and she stood with the confidence of a woman who already knew what was coming and was entirely at ease with it. Damien looked at Celine for a long moment. Then his eyes moved across the hall, slowly and with a deliberateness that should have felt strange to anyone watching closely, and they found Elara. She felt it before her mind had caught up with what she was feeling, the way the body sometimes registers something significant before the thinking part has had time to process it. A drop in the air. A sudden cessation of something she had not noticed was present until it was gone. The hair on both her arms lifted at once. Her stomach went cold. She held herself very still and looked back at him, and what she found in his expression was something she had never seen directed at her before. It was not attraction. It was not the kind of attention a man pays to a woman he has just noticed and wants to know better. It was something more clinical than that, more deliberate. It was the expression of a man looking at something he had already decided on and was now confirming was exactly what he had been told it would be. The satisfied assessment of someone checking a very important box. He said her name, not Celine's name, not the name of the woman he had spent 6 weeks courting with formal visits and arranged meals and the careful performance of genuine interest. He said Elara's name in a voice that was calm and completely clear and utterly without apology. As though this moment was the one the past 6 weeks had all been building toward, as though everything before tonight had been a stage set for exactly this. The hall came apart. Celine made a sound that cut through the rising noise of the crowd before being swallowed by it, something sharp and sudden that was not quite a scream, but was more than a gasp, the sound of someone receiving a shock they were not in any way prepared for. Then everyone was talking at once, and the elder council was rising from their ceremonial seats, and people were turning to each other with expressions of confusion and alarm, and the organized celebration that had been minutes away collapsed into something complicated and loud. Elara stood very still. This was something she had trained herself to do in her years working in the healer's hall. When a situation changed suddenly and without warning, when something went wrong in the middle of what had been routine, when everyone else in the room began reacting before they had properly understood what they were reacting to, she had developed the habit of making herself hold still first, just long enough to understand what was actually in front of her before she moved. It was not a performance of calm. It was a deliberate act of self-management, and it had served her in enough difficult moments that it had become instinct. Damien walked toward her. He moved through the crowd the way powerful men moved when they had decided something and nothing was going to alter the decision. Slowly, without hesitation, with the absolute certainty that whatever stood between him and where he was going would move before he needed to make it move. And it did move. The crowd parted for him, because whatever else Damien Cole was, he was strong and high-ranking, and in a world governed by pack hierarchy, those two things together meant that standing between him and what he wanted required a specific kind of courage that was not available to everyone. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the small pale scar beneath his left eye, close enough that she could see exactly when the expression he had been wearing for 6 weeks, the warmth he had performed so convincingly for Celine and for both Pax councils, went out completely, like a candle being extinguished by 2 fingers. Here, and then gone. He leaned slightly toward her. "You are not my choice," he said. The noise of the room was loud enough that only she could hear it. "You are my weapon." She looked at him. In the healer's hall, she had held her steadiness through fevers that broke at 3 in the morning, and injuries that would have turned her stomach if she had allowed herself to look at them rather than address them. She had held it through the long, specific grief of sitting with someone who was not going to recover, and who needed someone nearby who was not falling apart. She had held it in every difficult moment her training had put in front of her, and she held it now, in a hall full of noise and chaos, and a man who had just said something that no person should ever say to another, and she looked at him with the clear and completely steady gaze of someone who was listening to absolutely every available piece of information. Then she looked past his shoulder and found her sister in the crowd. Celine was standing exactly where she had been standing when the ceremony began. The red dress was very bright in the candlelight. Her face had gone the color of the white flowers hanging from the rafters. Both hands were pressed over her mouth, and in her eyes, Alara looked for what she expected to find there. Looked for the twin instinct that should have been rising right now like a tide. The outrage on her behalf. The absolute refusal to allow this to continue. The voice that should have been loud above the noise. She found shock, genuine shock, real and visible. She found grief. And underneath both of those things, lasting only for one single second, she found something else. Relief. It was gone before most people would have caught it. Celine blinked, and the expression shifted into something more appropriate for the moment, something that looked like a sister, watching something terrible happen to her twin. But Alara had seen it. She had spent 24 years reading that face. She had never once been wrong about what she saw in it. Something fractured in the center of her chest then, quietly and precisely, along a seam she had not known was there. She did not let it reach her face. The elders argued loudly for 20 minutes. There was shouting and legal citation, and a great deal of consultation between older men, who very urgently did not want to be responsible for whatever the outcome of this evening was going to be. Pack law allowed a male to name his chosen at a claiming ceremony. It did not say anywhere that the named individual had to be the woman he had spent weeks courting. It was highly irregular. It was openly cruel. It was, by any reasonable human standard, a wrong thing to do. But it was not, strictly speaking, illegal. Her mother tried to reach her. She could see her father above the heads of the crowd, his face carrying an expression of fury that had gone very quiet, the way very large fury sometimes did, searching for her, trying to move in her direction. But the crowd was dense, and Damien had positioned himself between her and the rest of the room, with the practiced ease of someone who had planned exactly this. The mark was placed on her wrist before she had fully understood that she could have spoken to prevent it. She would think about this later, in one of the long nights that followed, in the dark of a room that did not belong to her. She could have refused. Pack law allowed refusal. It required the individual to speak the refusal out loud and clearly, before the mark was applied. But she had spent 20 minutes in a state of controlled shock, doing the thing she always did under pressure, which was holding herself together on the outside, while everything on the inside reorganized itself around the new and terrible shape of what was happening to her. She had been still when she should have been loud. She had been waiting to understand when she should have been speaking. The mark was placed. The law was the law. They brought her out to the courtyard and put her in a car that night. There was no time for a proper farewell. Her mother was not permitted to approach. Her father stood at the edge of the courtyard, with his hands pressed into fists at his sides, and his jaw working, and his eyes filled with something she had not seen in them in 24 years of watching his face, and she met his gaze for one long moment, as they walked her past him, and she kept her expression steady, and her eyes on his for as long as she could, before they put her in the car and closed the door. Because if she let herself feel it right now, all of it at once, she was not certain her legs would carry her. The car moved. The lights of Ashwood disappeared behind a long curve in the road. She pressed her palms flat against her knees, and she breathed, slowly and evenly. The way she had taught frightened patients to breathe, when the pain was large enough that the only real option was to move through it one breath at a time, keeping the panic at a manageable distance, staying present and functional for the next moment, and then the moment after that. She did not speak during the drive. Damien sat across from her. The car was large and expensive, the kind of vehicle that communicated wealth through its quietness and the quality of its materials. He watched her with the same assessing expression he had worn when he said her name across the hall. She looked out the window. She thought about her room in the healer's hall, the green curtains, the books stacked beside the bed that she had been meaning to reorganize for months, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam that she replaced every season. She thought about the patients she had been scheduled to see in the morning. Old Mr. Hale, whose knee ached reliably in cold weather, and who always wanted to talk for longer than the appointment required. The Perkins children, who both had a cough that was improving, but needed one more week of monitoring before she would feel comfortable closing the case. A young woman named Claire, who was expecting her first child, and came to see Alara every other week, because, she had once told Alara. Alara explained things in a way that made the uncertainty feel bearable. She thought about Celine's face. She filed it away with the discipline she had been practicing since she first started working in the healer's hall, the ability to set aside the thing that would undo her right now, in order to remain functional for what the current moment required. She would deal with it properly later. Right now she needed to understand where she was going and what she was going to find when she got there. She turned from the window. "What bloodline?" she said. Damien looked up from something he had been reading on his phone. Something moved briefly in his expression. A very small recalibration. He had been expecting silence. He had been expecting, if she spoke at all, something emotional and therefore manageable. "What did you say?" he asked. "You told me I was a weapon," she said. "Weapons have purposes. I would like to know what mine is." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something at the corner of his mouth shifted, not warmth, but a kind of professional reconsideration. The look of someone who had been given less credit than was due. "Your healing bloodline," he said. "It is documented across 6 generations in the old Ashwood Pack records. Accelerated healing facilitation at a physiological level, not a trained skill. My pack is preparing for an operation that will put my strongest people at serious risk of injury. Standard healers extend recovery by 3 to 5 days, compared to what your bloodline can achieve. I cannot afford that gap." She absorbed this. "You spent 6 weeks courting my sister," she said, "in order to establish the legal and social proximity, to observe me closely enough to confirm what the records told you." 6 weeks confirming what I already knew, he said. Celine was the approach. You were the objective. She looked out the window again. The anger came then, not hot and uncontrolled but cold and precise, settling into the center of her chest with the quiet deliberateness of something being placed exactly where it needed to be. She kept it off her face. She had learned a long time ago that cold anger was far more useful than hot anger. Hot anger announced itself and burned itself out, and left you empty and obvious. Cold anger stayed. Cold anger could be held and directed and used at exactly the right moment, which this was not. She was going to need it later. The Coldwater Pack compound appeared after close to 2 hours of driving, stone walls and heavy iron gates, and a cluster of buildings that had been designed entirely around function. There was no softness anywhere in the architecture, no unnecessary ornamentation. It looked exactly like the man who ran it. They showed her to a room on the 2nd floor. It was not cruel. There was a proper bed and a bathroom and a window that looked out over the eastern section of the compound wall, but there was no handle on the inside of the door. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the door for a long moment. Then she turned and went to the window and looked out at the wall and the dark land beyond it, and she began, as methodically and as carefully as she had begun every complex case she had ever faced, to think. She had her mind. She had 7 years of training, under one of the most thorough and demanding healers she had ever met. She had the observation skills that training had sharpened, and the habit of noticing things people did not intend to reveal. She had the cold, precise anger sitting ready in the center of her chest. She had the small notebook in the inside pocket of her dress. She always carried one. It was a healer's habit, a place to write down what she observed, before memory had a chance to smooth the details into something less accurate than what had actually happened. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she opened the notebook, and she began to write. She wrote down every word Damien had said, in the order he had said it. She wrote down everything she had observed of the compound during the drive-in, the number of guard positions she had been able to count, the location of the gates, the distance and timing of the drive so she could estimate how far she was from Ashwood. She wrote down the specific things she had noticed about the room, the window angle, the orientation, the door. She stopped for a moment, and pressed her palm flat against the page, and felt the texture of the paper under her hand, and breathed. She was going to get through this. She did not know yet exactly how. She did not know who was going to help her, or what it was going to cost, or how long it was going to take. But she had spent 24 years being the twin that nobody worried about, and she had survived every one of those years by paying attention, when no one was watching, by being steadier than circumstances seemed to require, and by never once allowing someone else's assessment of her worth to become the assessment she used for herself. Damien Cole had looked at her and seen a weapon. He had not been careful enough in his looking. She wrote until her hand ached. Then she put the notebook away and lay down fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling in the dark, while the compound settled around her into its nighttime rhythms. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full wrongness of it, the injustice of it, the specific, personal violation of having been chosen not as a person, but as a biological function. She let herself feel all of it during those 5 minutes, and then she put it away. Because tomorrow was coming, and tomorrow, she was going to begin doing the most important thing she had ever done in her life. She was going to pay attention. She closed her eyes, and breathed and waited for morning, which was what the moment required, and waiting, when it was the only available option, was something she had always been genuinely good at. Elara was awake before the compound. The window was still dark, and the air outside still carried the cool, suspended quality of the hour before dawn, the particular stillness that existed between the end of the night and the beginning of the day. She had learned to recognize this hour during years of overnight shifts in the healer's hall. It was the hour when patients who were seriously ill became most honest, when the things they had been holding back during the day sometimes came loose in the quiet, and when the person sitting with them needed to be present and steady and entirely awake. She was all of those things now. She sat at the edge of the bed and pressed her feet to the cold floor and went through everything she had written the night before, reading her own notes with the focused attention she brought to a complex patient file before an examination. She was building a picture of her situation, and like all pictures built from observation rather than assumption, it needed to be looked at honestly and completely to be of any use. She went to the small bathroom and washed her face with cold water. She stood in front of the mirror for a moment. The face looking back at her was the same face that had been in that hall last night, the same face that Celine wore, the face that had been seen by Damien Cole and assessed and decided upon. She looked at it with the same directness she looked at everything, and she recognized herself in it, which mattered to her more than she could easily have explained. The door opened at 7 in the morning. A young woman came in carrying a tray with food and a clean set of clothes that were not Elara's own. She moved quickly, kept her eyes directed at the floor, and set the tray on the small table near the window without looking at Elara directly. "What is your name?" Elara asked. The young woman paused at the door. She was perhaps 20 years old, dark-haired, with the careful movements of someone who had learned to be small in the spaces she occupied. "Nora," she said, still looking slightly away. "Thank you for the food, Nora," Elara said. Her voice was easy, her posture open, no urgency in it at all. It was the tone she used with new patients who needed time and gentleness before they were ready to be honest about what was wrong. "Have you worked here long?" A pause. 3 years. "You must know the compound well by now," Elara said. It was not really a question. It was an observation, offered lightly and without expectation, the kind of thing that gave the other person room to either pick it up or set it down. "I should go," Nora said, and went. Elara sat down and ate. She noted everything about the food, the quality of it, the care with which it had been prepared, what it implied about how this compound was run. The food was good. Not elaborate, but good. Made by someone who understood nutrition and had decent materials to work with. This told her something. Damien Cole kept a well-maintained operation. He was not interested in cruelty for its own sake. He was interested in function, and she was a function, and he intended to keep the function in working order. Understanding this accurately was important because it told her what her leverage was. She spent the morning at the window. The compound below her was organized around a central yard that served as both training ground and general gathering space. Guards moved in rotations. She watched carefully, noting the timing of each change with the corner of her eye on the light outside, and counting the minutes in the way she had trained herself to count them accurately without a visible timepiece. 3 access points were visible from her window: the main gate at the compound's front, a secondary gate in the northern wall with less traffic, but what appeared to be an electronic code mechanism, and something at the far eastern end that looked like a delivery entrance, supervised more casually than either of the others. She wrote all of this down in the notebook, not with any specific plan yet, but because the healer's practice was to record what was there before deciding what it meant. At midday, Damien came to the room. He came without guards or witnesses, which was itself a choice and therefore information. He sat in the chair near the window without waiting to be invited, and he looked at her with the same assessing expression he had worn since the ceremony. "You are not afraid," he said. "Being afraid would not help me," she said. "Most people in your position would be." "I am not most people." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same open, observant expression she brought to every difficult conversation, looking for information rather than for a way to win, because information was what would eventually produce something useful. What do you know about treating injuries in field conditions? He asked. A considerable amount, she said. I trained for 7 years, under Elder Healer Gwen of the Ashwood Pack. She spent 15 years as a field healer, with the Northern Coalition, before she retired to teach, and she trained her students the way she had worked, which was practically, and without any assumption that conditions would be comfortable. I have treated injuries from training accidents, from 2 significant border disputes, and from the kind of situations that come with managing an active pack over several years. He nodded. He already knew this from whatever records he had consulted. He was confirming them against the reality of her. My warriors will be moving within 10 days, he said. The engagements will be serious, and the risk of significant injury is high. I need someone who can return injured fighters to active capacity faster than any standard healer can achieve. And you could not simply hire someone, she said. Standard healers add 3 to 5 days to a recovery timeline compared to what your bloodline provides, he said. I have read the historical documentation across 6 generations of your family. It is a physiological quality, not a trained skill. It cannot be hired or replicated. She looked at him steadily. You have given me more information than you needed to, she said. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. You told me the specific timeline, she said. 10 days. You told me the scale of the operation, significant injuries, multiple casualties anticipated. You told me the precise nature of what you need from me. You would not share those details unless you were either entirely certain you have complete control of this situation, or you are trying to make me feel that this is a cooperative arrangement rather than a captivity, because willing cooperation produces better results than minimum compliance. A pause. Both of those things are true, he said, and both are accurate. Then I have a condition, she said. The air in the room changed, not dramatically, slightly. The way air changed when something significant was being said that could not be taken back. You do not make conditions here, he said. I do, she said, keeping her voice level and her hands still in her lap. Because you need me fully functional and genuinely engaged, not simply present and technically performing the work. I will give you what you need, but I will give it to you as a person who has agreed to work, not as a resource that has been assigned a task. She held his gaze. I want a proper workspace, prepared with full medical supplies. Whatever I request in terms of equipment or materials, I receive promptly and without argument. And I want the names and relevant histories of any individuals I am expected to treat, so I can approach each case with proper preparation. He looked at her for a long moment. The silence lasted long enough to be meaningful. The workspace and supplies, he said. Without question, the names and histories, case by case, at my discretion. It was not everything she had asked for, but it was something real, and in the particular kind of negotiation she was now engaged in, the first victory was never about the size of the concession. It was about establishing that concession was possible, that she was not simply an object to be told what to do, but a person whose cooperation had to be at least partially earned, which meant she held something he wanted, which meant she had leverage she could use again. She nodded once. He stood. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, a small, habitual movement that she had already noted as something he did when a conversation had not gone exactly as he had intended. You are not what I expected, he said, without turning to face her. What did you expect? She asked. Easier, he said, and he went. She waited until she heard the lock engage. Then she let out a slow breath and pressed both hands flat against the surface of the small table, and looked at her own knuckles for a moment, while the shaking worked its way out through her palms. She had held herself completely steady through the entire conversation. Not one tremor had made it to the surface, but the adrenaline of it had to go somewhere, and her hands were where it went now that the door was closed. She had gotten something. She picked up her pen and wrote, "He gave ground. He gave ground because what he actually needs from me is my full ability and my willing engagement. A frightened healer holding back is not useful to him. A healer who is working at complete capacity because she has been given enough to work with is exactly what he needs. My willingness is something I control. I am not powerless here. I am in a situation that requires my genuine cooperation to work correctly, and that is not the same as being powerless." She set the pen down. In the training yard below her window, the afternoon session was beginning. She watched the warriors organize themselves and move through their drills, and she cataloged the hierarchy visible in all of it, who deferred to whom and how, who the three individuals were who stood slightly apart from the main group, and spoke to Damien with a marginally sharper quality of deference when he appeared in the yard. She watched and she noted and she wrote it down. That evening, when Nora came with the dinner tray, Ilara had prepared for the interaction. "Nora," she said, when the tray had been set on the table, "do you happen to know if there is any chamomile in the compound kitchen? I get headaches, and chamomile tea is the most reliable thing that helps them." It was not entirely untrue. She did have the beginning of a headache, the dull pressure behind her eyes that came from a day of sustained, focused attention. But the chamomile itself was not the point. The point was the exchange, the small transaction of one person asking another for something minor and manageable, the kind of exchange that built something in both directions without either person having to acknowledge what was being built. Nora looked at her with the careful evaluation of someone who had learned to keep a certain distance from people whose situations were uncertain. "I can check," she said. "That is very kind of you," Ilara said. And she meant it. 20 minutes later, the chamomile arrived in a small ceramic pot, still steaming. Nora handed it through the doorway with quick hands, as though she had decided to do this and did not want to give herself time to reconsider. "Thank you," Ilara said. "Truly, I will sleep better tonight." Nora almost smiled. She caught it before it completed, and she went. But the almost had been there, and Ilara had seen it, and she noted it the same way she noted everything. Progress. That night she lay in the dark and thought carefully about the days ahead. She thought about the warriors she had watched in the yard, and the timeline Damien had named, and what it meant to be here in this room, with a set of skills that someone else had decided were his property to use. She thought about what her actual options were, and which ones she had already begun to build, and which ones she did not yet have access to. And then she let herself think about Celine. She had been trying not to. Thinking about Celine led directly to the specific, deep pain of that look on her sister's face in the ceremony hall, and the pain of it was the kind that pulled at something so fundamental that she had not yet decided she was ready to approach it properly. She thought about it now, because the dark and the quiet were where she did her most honest thinking, and this needed to be thought about honestly. 24 years, every birthday and every childhood crisis and every late night, that one of them needed the other. She had always believed, without ever articulating it, that if something truly terrible happened to her, Celine would speak, would refuse to stay quiet, would make the choice, regardless of what it cost, to choose her. Celine had not. The love was real. She was not doubting that. But she was understanding now, in this room, without a handle on the door, what the limits of that love looked like. And understanding limits was not the same as abandoning what was within them. She would have the honest conversation with her sister, when there was time and space for it. She would have it thoroughly and without softening it, because that was the only way it could actually do anything useful. She believed it was possible for them to come through it. She intended for that to happen. But tonight, in this particular situation, the knowledge of that limit was not a wound. It was a piece of information, and she was learning to use every piece of information she had. She was the only person she could count on completely right now. She was going to make the most of that person. She closed her eyes. She breathed. Tomorrow the workspace would be ready, and in the workspace, she would continue to observe and record and wait for the thing she was certain was there, if she was patient enough to find it. Every situation had something its designers had not thought of. She was going to find this one. On the third morning, they prepared the workspace. It occupied a large room on the ground floor of the main compound building, connected through a short passage to a smaller anteroom that could serve as an examination space. Ilara spent the first 2 hours of her time in it going through every cabinet and drawer and shelf with the systematic thoroughness that Gwen had drilled into her from her earliest weeks of training. "You always cataloged before you began," Gwen had said, with the particular firmness she used for the things that were most important. "You do not assume you know what is there. You look at what is actually there, and you write it down, and then you know, and knowing is the only thing that is ever actually useful." The supplies were better than she had dared to hope. A full range of medical equipment, properly maintained. Bandaging materials clean and organized by type. Medicines covering both common and specialist needs. And medicines she had specifically wanted access to since she had understood what the next 10 days might require. Someone had spent real money on this workspace, or someone on Damien's staff understood medical supply well enough to do the procurement with genuine competence. Either way, it was better than she had expected, and better than she had feared, and she noted this carefully, because it told her something about how seriously Damien was taking the coming operation. She wrote everything down in the fresh notebook Nora had brought her along with a set of pens. She wrote in columns, by category, with notes on quantity and condition, and any gaps she identified, because gaps were as important to know as abundances. An organized healer is an effective healer. You do not search for the instrument when you need it. You know where it is, because you placed it there deliberately, and you track it, because that is what care looks like in practice. She missed Gwen in a specific, sudden way that surprised her with how sharp it was. She put it away and kept working. By the middle of the afternoon, she had a complete and accurate picture of what she had to work with. The workspace was genuinely excellent, better equipped than many of the facilities she had worked in during her training. She had what she needed. She had also, by spending these hours in a ground-floor room connected to the rest of the compound's routine activity, begun to understand the rhythms of the place in much more detail than the view from her second-floor window had allowed. People moved through the corridor outside the workspace door regularly. Not all of them stopped, but the door had been left open by the guard who had brought her here in the morning, and left open it had stayed, which was either oversight or instruction, and she filed it either way as useful. Nora came at her usual times, and 3 times Alara was warm and interested and careful not to ask anything that might alarm her. They talked about small things, the source of the good food from the kitchen, the best time of day to see the light come through the corridor windows. Nora mentioned 2 other household staff members by name in passing. Alara added both names to her internal record without appearing to pay them any particular attention. On the second day in the workspace, Damien's warriors began to come. They came not because they were injured, they were all currently healthy and training hard, but because Damien had sent word that the healer was available for general consultation, and warriors working at high intensity always had something that needed addressing. An old joint injury that had been managed badly for years, a bruising pattern from sparring that had never quite resolved, a persistent muscle issue that affected performance in a specific direction of movement. They came one at a time, or in pairs, and they sat in the examination anteroom, and Alara listened to them and examined them, and gave them accurate, practical guidance, in a voice that was calm and direct, and entirely without judgment. She asked their names. She remembered every one. Owen was first, tall and fair-haired, probably 27, with a right shoulder injury from a training accident 3 years earlier that had never been properly rehabilitated. The original damage had healed, but the way it had healed had left him compensating in his movement patterns in a way that was creating secondary strain across his neck and upper back. She showed him the specific adjustment to make to his stance that would reduce the load on the affected area. He watched her demonstrate it with the careful attention of someone who had been given useful information for the first time in a long time, and then he looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, and not quite gratitude, but was something in that territory. "Nobody has noticed that before," he said. "It is subtle," she said, "but it accumulates." Carter came on the second morning. He moved with the particular economy of someone trained at a high level, every movement purposeful, and nothing wasted. He was completely well, no issues she could identify, which meant he had come to the workspace for a reason other than medical need. She suspected Damien had sent him to observe how she worked, and what she said, and whether she was what she appeared to be. She gave him the same open, professional attention she gave everyone, noted that his blood pressure was slightly elevated, and suggested he increase his water intake, and sent him back with nothing to report except that she was calm and organized, and apparently unconcerned about anything. Lily came on the third afternoon. She managed the compound's internal records, and she had a migraine condition that had been incorrectly treated for years, with medication suited to a different pattern of migraine than the one she actually had. Alara recognized the pattern immediately, from a combination of Lily's description of what the migraines felt like, and the specific timing she described. She revised the treatment protocol, and explained the change carefully. Lily looked at her for a long moment when she finished. "Is it really that simple?" Lily asked. "The adjustment is simple," Alara said. "Identifying the correct pattern takes attention to the specific details, rather than applying a general answer to a general problem. Most people get the general answer. It does not always help." This was what she was genuinely good at. The specific, the particular, the patient accumulation of accurate detail that added up to something actually useful. It was also what was building her, quietly and without drama, a particular kind of standing in this compound. Not the standing of someone who had been claimed and brought here by force. The standing of someone whose work spoke for itself. On the 5th day, she overheard the conversation that changed the shape of everything she was building. It was late afternoon, and she was at the workspace counter, working on a batch of the recovery compounds that she would need in quantity in the coming days. The task required her hands and her focus, but left her hearing available. And when 2 of the senior guard captains came into the workspace together carrying minor training injuries and talking to each other in the low, unhurried way that people talked when they had decided the person nearby was part of the furniture rather than a listener, she let them continue believing that. She kept her hands busy and her face neutral, and she listened. 3 packs confirmed for the Eastern Agreement, the taller one said, holding out his wrist for her to examine, without pausing the conversation. The Northern Boundary Pack, Cole's people, and the Ridge faction. What does the Alpha King's territory figure into it? The other asked. That is the entire point, the first said. Cole wants the combined territory of the Eastern Agreement large enough that the Alpha King cannot respond with force without committing to a conflict he is not positioned for. He has to negotiate. And if he decides to challenge anyway? A short, flat laugh. That is what the healer is for. Keeps us functional through whatever response comes. Good for another 2 or 3 engagements beyond the first. She continued working. Her expression did not change. Her hands did not stop. She gave them nothing to note, nothing to remember, nothing that would tell them she had heard anything significant. When they left, she went to the notebook and wrote every word. She was building something real now. Not just an understanding of her own situation, but a picture of something much larger and much more significant, the specific shape of what Damien was planning, who was involved, and what was at stake. The picture was not yet complete, but it was growing every day. The Alpha King. King Cale Draven. She had grown up knowing the name the way everyone in the shifter world knew it, as a background reality, the kind of authority so fundamental that it was easy to stop actually thinking about it. The head of the ruling pack, the highest authority in the hierarchy. Not someone who appeared in the texture of daily life, but someone whose presence shaped all of it, the way the sky shaped the weather, without being visible in it directly. Damien Cole was building something, with the specific intention of forcing Cale Draven into a corner. And she was one of the pieces he was using to build it. She sat with that for a long time after writing it down. She thought about what it meant for the decisions she was going to need to make, and when she was going to need to make them, and what she had available to work with when the time came. On the 6th day, a letter arrived. Nora brought it with the morning tray, and set it down with hands that were slightly more careful than usual, which told Ilara that Nora knew what it was, and was not sure how she felt about having delivered it. Ilara recognized the handwriting before she touched the envelope. She had watched that handwriting develop over 24 years, from the rounded, careful printing of childhood to the particular looping script her sister had settled into as a teenager. She held it for a while before opening it. She drank half her tea. She watched Owen in the yard below, adjusting his shoulder the way she had shown him. Not perfectly, but noticeably better than it had been 4 days ago. And she felt the small, specific satisfaction of work that had been worth doing. Then she opened the letter. Ilara, it began, and then the word she had been expecting. I am sorry. Celine wrote 3 pages. She wrote about the shock of the ceremony, the guilt that had been with her every hour since that night, the feeling she had felt in the single second when Damien said Ilara's name instead of hers. She named the feeling directly. She did not try to make it smaller or more defensible than it was. She wrote the way she always wrote in letters, with an honesty she found easier on paper than in person, because paper gave her time to find the words she actually meant. Ilara read it twice. She folded it carefully and held it in her hand. The guilt was real. The love was real. She believed both. She also believed that Celine had not known the specifics in advance, had not been part of the planning, had spent 6 weeks allowing herself to believe in a courtship that she had probably known, somewhere in the part of her that was honest when she let it be, had something uncomfortable underneath it, had chosen not to press that edge. She would not hold it against her sister permanently. She intended to have the honest, difficult conversation with Celine when there was space for it, and she believed they would come through it. But right now, in this room, What that look on Celine's face had told her was a piece of information she needed to hold accurately. She was the person she could count on completely. Everyone else was uncertain. That was not a tragedy. That was the situation, and she was very good at working with situations as they actually were. She wrote back, short and careful. She was well. The workspace was good. She loved her. She sent it through Nora, who took it with hands that were becoming less cautious by the day. On the 7th day, she found the hatch. She was reorganizing a set of supply cabinets in the far corner of the workspace when she found it behind the lowest shelf. A small access hatch bolted from this side, painted the same color as the surrounding wall. She might have missed it if she had not been working systematically from one end of every surface to the other. She crouched and pressed her fingertips to its edge. The draft was immediate and clear, cool and carrying the particular freshness of outdoor air, slightly damp, with a faint quality that she associated with open grass rather than enclosed space. She did not open it. Not yet. She did not know what was on the other side, and opening it without that knowledge could reveal something she was not yet ready to reveal. She memorized its exact position down to the measurements she estimated with her eyes, covered it again with the supply boxes, and stood and went back to her cataloging. She walked to the workspace sink and ran cold water over her wrists for a moment, the way she did when she needed to bring herself back to the surface of things quickly. Then she dried her hands and picked up her pen. For the first time since the night of the ceremony, she felt something that was not strategy, and not grief, and not cold, useful anger. She felt the specific warmth of genuine possibility. She began to plan more carefully. The 8th day brought an arrival nobody had planned for. Ilara was at the workspace counter in the morning, her hands occupied with a batch of recovery compounds and her mind working through the question of the hatch, when she heard the vehicles in the main yard. She had been in this compound long enough to know the sound of its regular traffic, the specific engine notes and arrival patterns that belonged to the compound's daily routine. These vehicles were different. Multiple cars arriving simultaneously, and they were wrong in a way that was hard to isolate but immediately perceptible. Not the dark, functional vehicles she had learned to recognize, something older but more deliberately maintained, with the particular quietness of machines that had been serviced with care rather than necessity. She moved to the high window, stepping onto the medical stool she had repositioned over days to give her the precise angle she needed over the compound yard. 4 cars, 12 people emerging, with the organized efficiency of people who were very competent at their work, and felt absolutely no need to announce that fact. They positioned themselves around the yard in a way that was clearly practiced, covering sight lines she would not have thought to cover, communicating without visible communication. They were not Damien's warriors. Everything about how they moved said they belonged to a different kind of authority entirely. The last person out of the lead vehicle was tall and wearing dark clothing that was unremarkable except for how precisely it fit, and he moved through the compound yard with a quality of presence that Ilara found, even from this distance, distinctly different from anything she had observed in the 8 days she had been here. Damien moved through spaces as though daring them to contest him. This man moved as though spaces simply organized themselves correctly in his vicinity, because that was what made sense. She could not see his face clearly from this angle and this distance, but she felt something she did not immediately have language for. Not threat, something different from threat. Nora came to the workspace door 20 minutes later. Her expression was the controlled expression of someone managing a reaction they did not want to show. "The Alpha King is here," Nora said, unannounced. "The Beta has asked that all non-essential personnel remain in their current locations." "Of course," Ilara said. She turned back to the counter. Her hands continued their work. Her mind sharpened to a point she could feel at the center of her attention. She thought very quickly and very carefully about what this meant, and what it offered, and what it required of her. The Alpha King was here unannounced. Damien's operation had not yet launched. The Eastern Agreement had not yet consolidated into the thing it was intended to become, which meant there was still a window in which the shape of the coming days could be changed. She was still thinking when the workspace door opened again. She turned, expecting Nora or one of the guards. The man who stood in the doorway was the man she had seen from the high window. Up close, the quality of his attention was even more distinct than it had seemed at distance. He looked at her the way very few people had ever looked at her. Not the quick social look that assessed and filed, not the look that saw Celine's twin, and therefore already believed it knew what it was looking at. He looked at her as though he were seeing something specific and was being very careful about what he did with that recognition. It lasted only a moment. Then Damien appeared in the doorway behind him, and the expression on Damien's face was the most genuinely unsettled expression she had seen him wear since she arrived in this compound. "The medical workspace," Damien said, with the careful control of someone managing something they did not want to show, not typically part of a facility review. "I have a general interest in medical provision," the man said. His voice was quiet. Not soft, there was nothing soft in it, but quiet, in the way that very deep water was quiet, containing more below the surface than was visible from above. A PAC's investment in its medical infrastructure tells you quite a lot about how its leadership prioritizes what matters. He was still looking at Alara. Not in a way that Damien could easily object to. The quality of it was not invasive or improper. It was the quality of someone paying genuine attention to something they had decided was worth paying attention to. "My healer," Damien said. Very deliberate. The possessive clearly intended. The man did not look at Damien when he said it. "Is she here willingly?" he asked. The room went entirely still for a moment. Alara watched Damien's jaw tighten slightly, watched him construct his answer. "She was claimed in full accordance with PAC law," Damien said. "Before 3 packs of witnesses, everything was conducted correctly." "That is not what I asked," the man said. He said it without raising his voice at all. Damien held the pause for exactly 1 beat. "She is here, and she is working. Ask her directly if you want to know." The man's eyes moved to Alara. Directly and without apology. She looked back at him. She had a fraction of a second to think, and she used all of it. 8 days of work in the journal. The information she had been building. The hatch she still needed to explore. What would happen to all of it if she answered this question directly and honestly, in a room full of Damien's people, and gave Damien a reason to remove her from the workspace and lock her somewhere with no observation and no contact? But she also thought about how the question had been asked. The quality of it. It was not the question of someone gathering data efficiently. It was the question of someone trying to give her an opening, while being careful not to close it, by forcing a direct answer that would put her at risk. "I am working," she said. True. Not an answer to what had been asked. She was certain he understood the difference. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded. The small, precise nod of someone who has received information through a channel that was not the direct one. And he turned and walked back through the doorway with Damien. The door remained open. She could hear their voices moving down the corridor. She turned back to the counter. She breathed slowly. She kept working. That evening, she found the note. Nora had brought dinner, and Alara had been at the high window and had not heard it arrive. She found it when she turned away from the window, a small folded square on the floor near the base of the door, pressed flat as though it had been slid through the gap deliberately and carefully. She picked it up, unfolded it. The handwriting was clear and economical, the handwriting of someone who wrote with purpose and did not need extra loops to fill space. "You do not have to perform bravery. I already see it." She stood holding it for a long time. She was not sure how long. Long enough that Nora came to check on her, and found her still at the center of the room with the note in her hands, and had the quiet grace to retreat without saying anything. Alara folded the note twice, and put it in the same pocket with Celine's letter and her small private journal. She sat down at the work table, and she let herself, for the first time in 8 days, feel something that was not strategy or grief or controlled, useful anger. Just for a few minutes, she let it be what it was. Then she got back to work. The compound settled into its night routines. She could hear the Alpha King's party somewhere in the main building, the occasional murmur of voices at a distance, the specific sound of a meeting being conducted. She cataloged the sounds the way she cataloged everything, and added them to the picture she was building. The next morning she made her move on the hatch. She came to the workspace before Nora's first round, in the gray pre-dawn hour when the compound was at its quietest. She moved the supply boxes with careful hands, and opened the hatch. The outdoor air arrived immediately, cool and carrying the smell of damp grass and the particular freshness of early morning outside of walls. She moved through the narrow passage without hesitation, her body low, her hands feeling the walls in the dark, and she pressed open the second hatch at the far end. She was behind the main compound building, in the space between the outer wall and a row of storage structures that blocked sightlines from the primary guard positions. She stood for one moment in the outdoor air, breathing it deliberately, and she looked at the wall, and the guard rotation, and the specific window in that rotation that she had been calculating from the second floor for 7 days. She was not running this morning. She was not ready to run yet. She needed to know where she was going before she moved in that direction, and she needed to know what she was bringing with her that would matter. But she knew the hatch worked. She came back through, replaced everything, washed her hands, and sat at the work table with both palms flat against the surface. She felt the warmth again, the specific, practical warmth of possibility that had something real under it. At midday, Damien came. He was tense, in a way she had not seen before, the particular tension of someone running too many things at once and trying not to let the load show on the outside. She recognized it because she had seen it on Gwen during the most complex cases, the specific quality of a skilled person at the edge of their management capacity. The Alpha King has requested a further conversation with you before his party departs, Damien said. I will be present throughout. You will be cooperative and professional. You will confirm that your presence here is voluntary and that your work is satisfactory. Nothing more than that. She looked at him. I will be professional, she said. He studied her face. She gave him nothing to read in it. Whatever you think you are doing, he said, I want you to understand that I have had more time to plan this than you have had to respond to it. She said nothing. She simply waited, with her hands easy at her sides, until he left. Then she thought about what he had said for a long moment. People who were genuinely ahead of a situation did not usually need to say so. The need to say it was itself information about the size of the gap between his certainty and his actual confidence. The meeting was in Damien's formal reception room, a large and deliberately impressive space. 4 of his senior guard positioned around it with practiced deliberateness, 2 of the Alpha King's people near the door, with the watchful stillness of people who were very good at being in rooms without appearing to be doing anything in particular. Cale Draven was already there when she arrived. He was standing at the window, looking out, and he turned when she came in, with the promptness of someone who had been watching for exactly this. She sat. Damien sat across from her. Cale remained standing. Your background, Cale said, addressing her directly, and without preamble, is in pack healing. Ashwood Pack. 8 years. 7 years, she said. I began at 17. He noted the correction with a small nod. He had been testing whether she would be precise about a detail that did not significantly change the picture. She had been. What is your current role here? He asked. Medical preparation, she said. General care for pack members, and preparation for a more intensive role in the near future. Accurate, not giving Damien what he had asked for. Are you here willingly? He asked. The room went quiet. She held his gaze. I am here legally, she said, under pack law, following a claiming ceremony conducted before witnesses from 3 packs. He absorbed this with the particular stillness of someone who was listening to what was being said, and to what was not being said at the same time. Is there a difference, he asked carefully, between being here legally and being here willingly? Damien's hand moved on the armrest of his chair. A tiny movement. In this particular context, Ilara said, that is a complicated question to answer. He looked at her for one more moment, then he turned to Damien, and the meeting continued on its official surface, and she sat and said nothing else, and listened to all of it. When she was back in the workspace, she went immediately to her notebook. She wrote every word she remembered from the exchange. She wrote what she had observed about how he asked the questions, and what he had done with her answers. She read what she had written. He had come unannounced. He had asked to speak with her specifically, twice. He had asked the same question twice, and accepted indirect answers both times, which was not the behavior of someone gathering information efficiently. It was the behavior of someone trying to help her confirm something without putting her at risk, by requiring a direct answer in an unsafe room. She wrote, he knows, or he very strongly suspects. He is not here for the official reason. She thought about the note. I already see it. She took a clean sheet of paper from the supply drawer, and she wrote quickly and precisely what she had overheard about the Eastern Agreement, the 3 packs involved, the timeline, the intended use of her healing ability to support a campaign aimed at forcing the Alpha King's hand. The specific operational details she had gathered over 8 days. Names, where she had them. She folded it twice, small enough to transfer without being visible. She went to find Nora. Nora was in the corridor. "I need to ask you something," Ilara said. She kept her voice easy and her posture open. "I am not asking because I want to put you in difficulty. I am asking because you have been the only person in this compound who has treated me as a person, rather than as a function. And that means something real to me, and I believe you understand the difference between what the rules allow and what is actually right." Nora stood very still. "What do you need?" she said. Ilara held out the folded paper. "Someone from the Alpha King's party," she said. "Anyone in his group, before they leave." Nora looked at the paper for a long moment. She looked at Ilara, then she took it. She turned and walked quickly away without saying anything. Ilara went back to the workspace and sat down and pressed her hands flat against the surface of the work table and breathed. An hour later, Nora came back. Her color was high, and she was working to keep her breathing level. "Done," she said. "One of the tall ones, near the lead car." He took it without a word. Ilara let out a slow, quiet breath. "Thank you," she said, with everything she meant by it. "I hope it works," Nora said quietly. Then she was gone. Ilara went to the high window and stood on the stool and watched. The convoy was preparing to leave. She watched the vehicles move toward the main gate. The lead vehicle stopped at the gate for 1 moment longer than the mechanism required. She watched until the gate closed behind them. She stepped down from the stool. She sat on it. She let herself be still for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. She had work to do, and 1 day left to do it in. It was still fully dark when the knock came. She was on her feet before she was completely awake, standing in the center of the room with her notebooks already secured in the inside pocket of her jacket, because 9 days in a place where she was not safe had done something to her reflexes that she had not consciously arranged, but did not object to. The guard who opened the door was not one she had seen in any of her 9 days of careful observation. That was information before he said a word. "The beta wants you downstairs," he said. She went with him through corridors that were running at a different frequency than any previous morning she had seen. The purposeful tension of the past 2 days had converted into something sharper and more specific, the particular quality of an operation that has already begun moving and cannot be slowed or reversed. People moved through the compound with purpose rather than habit. Voices were clipped to the minimum required. Even the light seemed different, the specific charged quality of a space that is preparing for something with consequences. Damien was in the main hall at a long table covered with detailed maps and communication equipment. He did not look up when she entered. His 3 senior officers were positioned around the table, and they looked at her briefly with the incurious glance of people who had filed her under known and therefore uninteresting some time ago. "First units move at dawn," Damien said, still looking at the maps. "I want you in the workspace from that point, ready for inbound casualties within 3 hours of first light. The engagements will be fast, and the injuries will be serious." "I am ready," she said. He looked up, the same assessment as always, the evaluation of a resource checking its current status. "You have performed well here," he said. It was not warmth. It was professional recognition of a function that had been executed correctly. "Whatever happens in the coming hours, the people who came to your workspace this week will recover faster because of what you did. That is a real contribution." She understood this for exactly what it was. "I will be in the workspace," she said. She went. She spent the hour before dawn doing precisely what she had said she would do. She set out materials in the order she would need them, organized by the categories of injury she was most likely to encounter, based on everything she had learned about the nature of the operation. She worked through the preparation with complete professional focus, because whatever was about to happen outside these walls, the people who came through her workspace door would be people who were hurt and frightened, and they deserved every bit of skill and care she could give them, regardless of the decisions that had put them in this situation. She was a healer. That did not become untrue, because the surrounding situation was wrong. At first light, she heard it. Not from the direction she expected. Not from the east, where the operation was supposed to be launching. From the west. A large, organized sound, multiple vehicles moving fast and with precision, the particular acoustic quality of a significant number of people arriving together, rather than individuals making their way in. She went to the high window and stepped onto the stool. What she saw was not what she had expected to see. The vehicles approaching from the west were not Damien's. They were not coming from the direction of the operation. They were coming fast and in large numbers, and they carried the markings she had seen in old pack law reference texts during her training years. The royal insignia, the Alpha King's enforcers. She stepped down from the stool and walked back to the work table and sat down. She folded her hands in front of her on the work table's surface. She was sitting exactly like that, completely still, her workspace organized and her materials prepared, when the door opened 30 minutes later. Cale Draven came in alone. No guards immediately visible, though she could sense his people in the corridor through the open doorway. He stopped when he saw her, and the expression that crossed his face was not what she had expected. "You stayed in the workspace," he said. "I had preparation to complete," she said. He looked at the organized trays, the prepared materials, the systematic readiness of everything in front of her. "You set up for incoming casualties," he said, not a question. He was reading the workspace the way she read a situation, understanding what was there. "People were going to be hurt today regardless of how the morning developed," she said. "I prefer to have done everything I can before they arrive, rather than after." Something moved across his face, and it was not the professional assessment she had seen before. It was something quieter and more personal, the specific look of someone encountering something they had not anticipated finding here. He was quiet for a moment. "The information you sent reached us in time to act," he said. "The Eastern Agreement was disrupted before it could consolidate into something that would have been much more difficult to address. Damien is being detained. The operation is finished." She absorbed this. "Is anyone hurt?" she asked. He paused. A brief pause, but she caught it. "Some minor injuries in the disruption," he said. "Nothing requiring the level of care you can provide." She nodded once. "Then I want to make sure this workspace is properly inventoried before it is closed. Some of these materials need to be returned to the appropriate suppliers, and the rest should be transferred somewhere they can be used rather than wasted." He looked at her for a long moment. The room was very quiet. "Ilara," he said, her name, in his voice, sounding like the specific word for a specific person, rather than a label applied to a category. "You are free," he said. "The claim is dissolved. Under pack law, a forced claiming has no legal standing once the claimant has been found in criminal violation. You can go wherever you want to go, including home." She held his gaze. She thought about her room, the green curtains, the books, the herbs, her patients who had been waiting for 9 days without her, Claire, Mr. Hale, Gwen, who would ask exactly the right questions in exactly the right order. She thought about the note in her pocket. "I will," she said, "but I would like to finish the inventory first. And I would like to speak with you properly at some point, in a setting that is less complicated than this one." He looked at her with the same steady, careful attention she had been on the receiving end of since the first time she saw his face. "There will be time for that," he said. Not a performance of certainty, a statement of what he intended. She found statements of intention more trustworthy than promises, and she filed the distinction carefully. He left the doorway. She turned back to the workspace. She had work to do, and she had always been someone who finished what she started. The drive home was entirely different from the drive that had brought her here. She was in one of the royal convoy's vehicles, which was quiet and well-maintained, with a driver who spoke only once, to ask whether the temperature was comfortable. There was no one watching her, no one positioned between her and the door. She reached out and pressed her fingers to the door handle on the inside and felt it respond to her touch. The simple mechanical fact of a handle that worked from this side. She let her hand fall back to her lap. She looked out the window at the road she had traveled in the opposite direction 9 days ago, passing the same landscape in reverse, and she let herself feel what it meant to be moving through it this way. Before leaving, she had found Nora in the corridor near the workspace. Nora had been pale, and her hands were not entirely steady, the aftermath of a morning that had been much more alarming than any morning she had been expecting. She had found Ilara and stood in the workspace doorway with her hands pressed together. "Are you going to be all right?" Ilara had asked. Because it was the first question. "I think so," Nora said. "They questioned me. I told them the truth." "That is exactly right," Ilara said. "That is what you should have done." Nora looked at her with the expression of someone deciding between the safe response and the honest one. "I am glad you are getting out," Nora said. "Come and find me," Alara said, "if things here become uncertain, or if you simply want to. The Ashwood Pack Healers Hall. Ask for me by name." She had meant it genuinely. Nora had understood that. She had also, before leaving, spent 20 minutes with Kale's protocol officer, asking specific and detailed questions about the exact legal process for formally dissolving the claim, what documentation existed, what her legal status was going forward, and whether there were any procedural steps she needed to initiate herself. The protocol officer had been thorough and had answered every question, and had looked at her by the end of the conversation with the slightly recalibrated expression of someone who had been prepared for emotional distress and had instead encountered a structured legal inquiry. She had her notebooks. She had the letter from Celine. She had the note. The rest she was leaving in the room. Her father was at the gate when the car arrived. He was standing at the edge of the road with his hands pushed into his jacket pockets and his face doing the thing it did when he was holding something very large together through pure will. She had seen this look twice before in her life. She had not expected to add a third occasion to the count. She was out of the car before it had fully stopped. He crossed to her in 3 steps and wrapped his arms around her, and she let herself be held for a full minute, which was longer than she usually allowed, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed the familiar specific smell of him, and let herself feel completely what it meant to be home, and safe, and held by someone who had never in 24 years made her feel like anything other than entirely, unconditionally chosen. She did not cry. The things that needed crying over were too recent and too large, and she needed more distance from them before she could approach them properly. But she stayed in the embrace. He did not say anything. He knew when words were right and when presence was better. She pulled back and looked at his face. He was older than he had looked 9 days ago. Fear did what time did, only faster. "I am all right," she said. "I know," he said, rough with the effort of keeping it level. "I always know with you." She squeezed his arm. "Take me home. Tea and my own room. That is all I want right now." She stopped at the healer's hall first, because she needed to. She needed to walk through the door of the place where she did the work that was hers, the work she had built carefully over 7 years, through her own effort and ability, and feel that it was still there waiting for her. Gwen was at her desk. She looked up when Alara came through the door. Her expression was the expression she always wore, contained and direct, the face of someone who had decided long ago that the space around difficult things was not improved by drama. "You look functional," Gwen said. "I am functional," Alara said. "Good," Gwen said. "Sit down and tell me what you learned." She talked for 2 hours. Everything, in the professional language of healing, organized chronologically, and with the level of detail that Gwen had always required from her students when reporting on anything that had actually taught them something. Processing it in this way mattered. Translating the experience into the frame of her work, rather than only holding it as something that had been done to her. Gwen listened without once interrupting, until she was completely finished. Then she said, "The recovery compound protocol you adapted for field conditions is worth documenting formally. I want it written up in full." Alara looked at her. The laugh came out without warning, and it was the full kind, the unguarded kind, that she had not heard from herself in 9 days, and it surprised her with how good it felt, and Gwen watched it with the expression she wore when something was satisfying, but she was not going to say so out loud. "There you are," Gwen said. Alara pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment, still feeling the warmth of it. "Is Claire all right?" she asked. "Claire is excellent. The baby is in excellent position. She was here 3 days ago and told me to tell you, if I saw you, that she has been saving all her questions, because you are the only one who explains things in a way that makes her feel like she understands, rather than like she should." Something settled deep and specific in Alara's chest. The particular satisfaction of a thread that had been paused but not cut. "I will see her next week," she said. Celine was sitting at the kitchen table when Alara came home. She had not been told her sister was coming. She was not surprised to find her. Celine was sitting with a cup of tea that had been there long enough to go entirely cold, both hands wrapped around it anyway, and she looked up when Alara appeared in the doorway, and her face did the thing Alara had been reading since they were born. This time there was no ambiguity in it, no relief, no performance of appropriate emotion over the top of something else. Only the specific, clear grief of someone who had spent 9 days sitting with the full weight of what she had done, and who had come here not because she expected to be immediately forgiven, but because she needed to face it in the same room as the person she had failed. "Hi," Celine said. "Hi," Alara said. She came in and sat across from her. She set her notebooks on the table between them. She looked at her sister's face, the same face, and all the different weight of 9 different days visible in it. "I read your letter," Alara said. "I know you did," Celine said. "I got yours." She looked down at the cold cup. "I need to say it to your face, in person, not in a letter. I need to say that I was there, and I saw what was happening, and I felt what I felt, and I did not speak. And I am sorry for it in a way that I cannot fully put into words yet, but I am going to keep trying to find them." Alara looked at her. "I know," she said. "I believe you." "That is not the same as forgiving me," Celine said. "No," Alara said, "it is not, but it is where we start." Celine's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together. She blinked it back. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Alara said. They sat in the kitchen together while the afternoon moved through the window, and the house held them both in the familiar, imperfect way it had always held them, carrying 24 years of shared history that could not be undone, but that could, if they were both willing to be honest and patient and to stay in the room when it was difficult, be built on. That evening, after Celine had gone home and her father had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Alara went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the green curtains and the books and the dried herbs on the ceiling beam, and let herself feel everything she had been managing carefully for 9 days. The grief of it, the anger, still present and cold, and no longer urgently needed as fuel, but not gone. The wrongness of what had been done to her, the specific fracture that had opened in the night of the ceremony, along a seam she had not known was there. She let herself feel all of it for as long as it needed. Then she picked up the note from the nightstand where she had placed it. She read it again. The clear, economical handwriting. The single sentence that had gone somewhere her management skills could not quite reach. "You do not have to perform bravery. I already see it." She put it back. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about Cale Draven for a long time in the quiet. Not the version of him she had seen in Damien's compound, though that was the only version she had. She thought about what she had actually observed in those few interactions, the quality of his attention, the precision of his questions, the way he had taken her indirect answers both times, and understood what was being said through them, rather than requiring direct speech in an unsafe room. The note that had arrived under the door. She was a person who trusted evidence over impression. She knew she had limited data. She also knew what the data pointed toward, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that it was pointing in a direction she was not opposed to investigating. In the days that followed, she went back to work. She saw Claire, who was 8 months along and doing excellently, and who greeted Alara with an embrace that was warmer than a standard healer-patient greeting, and entirely appropriate given the circumstances. They sat together for an hour, and Claire asked the questions she had been saving, and Alara answered each one with the care and specificity that she brought to every explanation, and by the end of the appointment, Claire looked the way she always looked when she left this room, which was steadier than when she had arrived. "I heard what happened," Claire said, at the end. "I am glad you are back." "So am I," Alara said. She addressed Mr. Hale's secondary inflammation, which she had been thinking about intermittently during the 9 days, and she adjusted his treatment plan, and explained the adjustment in the specific detail he required before he would commit to following it, and he left the appointment looking the way he always looked when he understood something properly, which was satisfied in a contained and private way. She had dinner with Celine twice that week. They were careful dinners, the kind where the hard conversation was not yet at the center of the table, but was clearly what everything was orbiting. They were getting closer to it with each pass. It was slow and it was real, and she believed it was going somewhere worth going. She wrote the recovery compound documentation Gwen had asked for. She wrote it thoroughly, with the level of detail that made documentation actually useful, rather than merely official. Gwen read it in one sitting, and set it down, and said nothing for a moment. "This should have been standard practice years ago," Gwen said. Someone had to figure it out under the wrong conditions, Alara said. Gwen looked at her with the expression that was the closest she ever came to warmth. You are difficult to rattle, Gwen said. I have had good training, Alara said. Some of it, Gwen said, was not from me. She thought about the note every day. She was honest with herself about this, and she did not try to make it smaller than it was, or to reason herself into, or out of anything about it. It was there, and it was real, and the person who had written it was a person she knew very little about, and had observed carefully, in 2 brief and complicated interactions. These facts were all equally true, and she held them all at the same time. On the 11th day, the formal letter arrived. She was in the middle of examining Mr. Hale's knee, which had developed a new secondary inflammation she needed to address carefully, when Gwen appeared in the doorway holding a cream-colored envelope with the royal seal and the expression of someone who found something interesting, but intended to say nothing about it unless asked. Alara finished the examination and the explanation and walked Mr. Hale out and took the envelope. It was a full legal document, formal and thorough, issued by the Royal Protocol Office, signed by 3 members of the Elder Council. It confirmed the complete dissolution of the forced claim in specific statutory language. It detailed the grounds and cited the relevant sections of PAC law. It was exactly what it needed to be, official and permanent and unambiguous. Below the official text, in handwriting she recognized now, was a single line written in pencil, rather than in the formal ink of the document above it. When you are ready, I would welcome the conversation we agreed to have. No title, no signature, just the line. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket and went back to see the rest of her patients. That evening she wrote back. She kept it short. She named the tea house, on the neutral ground between Ashwood and the open territory, a meeting place, with a long tradition of being used for exactly this kind of conversation, where the civility of the space made certain things easier to say, without the weight of anyone's territory in the room. She named a date. She named a time. She gave the letter to the royal courier who had been present in the general vicinity of the Healer's Hall for several days, with a quality of patient waiting that she had found increasingly difficult not to find amusing. She told Gwen where she was going. Good, Gwen said. She did not look up.
You are not going to say anything else?
Alara asked. I am going to say one thing, Gwen said. Do not let the drama of how you met him substitute for actually knowing him. The circumstances were significant. People are not their circumstances. I know that, Alara said. You do, Gwen said. That is why I said it once instead of twice. On the morning of the meeting, Alara wore the gray dress. She was conscious of the choice, and she made it deliberately. The gray dress was the dress she had been wearing the night of the ceremony. Wearing it today was a private statement to herself that she was not returning to any version of that night. She was going forward. She was bringing what she had learned with her, without apology, and without the need to pretend the past 9 days had not happened. She arrived at the tea house first. She chose the table with the best sightlines, which was a habit she was apparently keeping. She ordered chamomile, because it had accumulated meaning during the past 9 days, in a way that felt appropriate. She sat with her hands in her lap and breathed, and was completely present. He came in 7 minutes after the agreed time. He moved through the room with the same quality she had observed in Damien's compound, but here the quality was different. In the compound it had been the quality of someone managing an environment deliberately. Here, in this small tea house with its wooden tables and mismatched cups, and the kind of warm, accumulated light that came from years of regular use, it was simply the quality of a person coming in from outside. No management required, just arrival. His eyes found her immediately. He sat down across from her. Thank you for coming, he said. I said I would, she said. I know, he said. I was still glad when the letter arrived. She looked at him directly. I want to be straightforward with you, she said, because I think you are someone who prefers that. I am, he said. I do not know you, she said. I have met you twice in conditions that were not ordinary, and exchanged approximately 50 words with you, and received 1 note, and I have been thinking about you more than the available data would strictly justify. I am aware of all of this. I am not someone who allows the weight of a dramatic situation to do the work that actual time and honest attention should do. I make decisions based on real knowledge, not on impressions. He was listening with the full quality of attention she had noticed in him before, the kind that did not drift or calculate while she was speaking. "That is accurate," he said. "But I am also someone who is very good at noticing things," she continued. "And I have noticed specific things about you, in the limited opportunity I have had, and I am willing to investigate those observations properly, if you are willing to proceed at an appropriate pace." "What pace would that be?" he asked. "Slower than everything that has happened in the last 9 days," she said. "I have had enough of things that move fast and by force. From here, everything goes at the pace it actually needs to go, not faster, because of what happened before." He was quiet for a moment. She waited. "I have spent a significant number of years," he said, "moving at the pace that situations required, rather than any pace I would have chosen for myself. I find I have no argument with what you are proposing." She looked at him. "Then we start here," she said, "with tea. And you tell me something true about yourself that has nothing to do with your title, or what happened at Damien's compound." Something moved in his expression. A genuine recalibration. The look of someone encountering something they had not expected, and finding it more welcome than they were prepared for. "I can do that," he said. The chamomile arrived. The afternoon light moved slowly through the window, and laid a warm rectangle across the table between them. They talked for 2 hours. She learned that he had lost his mother when he was 9 years old, and that the loss had shaped in a specific and lasting way how he understood what it meant to be responsible for things. She learned that he had a dry and precise kind of humor that surfaced briefly in small, accurate observations, and then retreated quickly, as though it was not yet sure of its welcome. She learned that he read old pack history records for genuine pleasure, that he had spent 2 full days following a historical thread through a collection of documents, and had felt honestly and disproportionately annoyed when the thread ran cold. She told him about Gwen and what Gwen had taught her, and what Gwen had been. She told him about Claire and Mr. Hale, and the satisfaction of addressing a problem that had been mismanaged for years. She told him about the notebook she had been keeping since she was 17, the healer's record that was also, in its way. She told him that she was not what people expected when they looked at her face. "No," he said. "I understood that within 30 seconds. Most people do not understand it at all," she said. "Most people stop looking when they think they know what they are looking at," he said. "I am not very good at stopping." She looked at him across the table. "That is what the note said," she said. "That you already saw it." "I did," he said. "I walked into that workspace, and you were sitting at a table in a compound where you were being held against your will, with materials organized around you that you had prepared with complete professional care, and you gave me an answer that was technically true and substantively honest at the same time, and I thought I had never seen anyone manage a situation with that specific combination of intelligence and steadiness." She was quiet for a moment. "It was a situation that required a great deal of both," she said. "I know that now," he said. "I knew something of it then." She picked up her cup. "I would like to come back here," she said. "Next week, same time." He looked at her. "I would like that very much," he said. "I will be here first," she said. "You were here first this time," he said. 7 minutes, she said. "You were 7 minutes after the time I specified. The courier insisted on briefing me on the correct protocol for the meeting," he said. 14 points. She felt the laugh before it arrived, and when it came it was the full and unguarded kind. The kind that she had not heard from herself in 9 days. The kind that felt, in the releasing of it, like putting down something she had been carrying long enough that she had stopped noticing the weight of it. He was watching her when it finished. "There it is," he said quietly, simply noting something true, with no performance around the noting. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. "Next week," she said. "Next week," he agreed. She paid for the tea. He did not argue with her about it, and she noted this with approval. She stood and put on her jacket and picked up her bag and looked at him across the table for a moment. This man, who had asked a careful question in a room full of people working against her answer, and who had put a note under a door, and who had come into a tea house 7 minutes late because of 14 protocol points. "One more thing," she said. "Yes," he said. "Whatever comes between here and wherever this goes," she said, "I need you to understand that I am not someone who waits to be decided about. I make my own decisions. You make yours. Then we compare and see where we are. But I am not going to be claimed or chosen or decided upon again. I do the deciding for myself." He looked at her with complete and unhurried seriousness. "I am counting on exactly that," he said. She nodded once. She left. Outside, the late afternoon had turned the sky the color of pale gold at the edges, and the air was cool and completely clean, and she walked to her car with her hands in her pockets, and her steps easy, and her mind very quiet, in the particular way it went quiet when things were in the right order. She had her work, she had her patients, she had her sister, complicated and real, and in the slow process of becoming something new. She had Gwen. She had Mr. Hale's knee and Claire's baby, and the list of people who would be waiting for her when she opened the Healers' Hall doors on Monday. She had, for the first time she could clearly remember, a clear and specific sense of the shape of herself that was not defined by anyone else's version of who she was. Not the quieter twin. Not a weapon or a resource or a bloodline in a record book. Not the person at the left edge of every gathering. Herself, defined by her own long, honest record of how she actually showed up in the world. She drove home. She had dinner with her father, who asked no questions and was very good company. She went to her room. She lay down on her bed. She looked at the green curtains. She thought about next week with the specific, unhurried attention she brought to things that mattered. Then she closed her eyes. She breathed, slow and even. She slept. The meetings at the tea house became a weekly certainty. Elara arrived first every time. She noted this without attaching excessive meaning to it, the way she noted everything, accurately, and without the embellishment of interpretation. She arrived first because she was organized, and she liked to be in a space before she needed to navigate it. She ordered chamomile, because it had accumulated specific meaning through the 9 days in Damien's compound, and she saw no reason to set that aside. She sat at the table with the best sight lines, and she breathed, and she was present before he arrived. He was never more than 10 minutes late. He was always apologetic about it, in a way that was genuine, rather than performed, usually involving some specific and fairly absurd detail about what had intervened between the meeting and his arrival at it. The 14 protocol points had been the first. The second week it was a boundary dispute that had escalated during his drive that required him to handle 3 phone calls in the parking area of the tea house before he could come inside. The third week, it was a scheduling conflict created by 2 councils who had both been told their meeting was the priority and who had not communicated with each other to discover the contradiction. She listened to these explanations with the specific pleasure of someone learning how another person actually functioned in the world, rather than how they presented themselves in formal settings. He was, she was discovering, a person of considerable competence who was surrounded by complications that were almost entirely the result of other people's organizational failures. He managed them with the dry, contained patience of someone who had long since decided that frustration was not a useful response to things that were not going to change. She told him about this observation on the 4th week. He looked at her for a moment across the table. "My secretary told me something similar 6 years ago," he said. Her exact phrasing was, "You have the patience of someone who has made peace with the fact that other people are going to be other people," which sounds like a compliment but is actually an observation about low expectations. Elara pressed her fingers over her mouth for a moment. "She sounds like Gwen." "She would find that a very serious compliment," he said. "She respects competence the way other people respect status." "Gwen would say that competence is status," Elara said. "Your Gwen sounds like someone I would find very alarming in the best possible way," he said. It was, she realized, the first time he had used the word your in reference to something in her life, and the ease with which he had done it, the naturalness of it, landed somewhere in her that she noted, and then deliberately set aside to examine at a more appropriate moment, which was later in the evening in her room, with her notebook, and enough quiet to think properly. She was very good at the deliberate setting aside and later examination. It was a healer's skill, developed in the years of managing complex situations, that required her to process after the fact, rather than in the moment. They talked about his work. Not the ceremonial or political surface of it, which she had access to in the same way that anyone with a general education did, but the actual texture of it, what the decisions felt like from the inside, what the gap was between what it looked like from outside, and what it required to actually do. He spoke about it honestly and without self-aggrandizement, in the specific detail of someone who understood their work well enough to see both its importance and its limitations. She talked about hers, the long, quiet work of maintaining people's health, rather than only addressing it when it went wrong. The satisfaction of the consistent, ordinary care that did not make for dramatic stories. The challenge of building trust with patients who had learned to be nervous in medical settings. The specific reward of a patient who came back to say that something she had told them 3 months ago had turned out to be right, and that they had remembered it and used it. She talked about Celine. Not all of it, not yet. But she told him that she had a twin sister, and that their relationship was in the process of being rebuilt around a more honest understanding of what it had always been, and that this was difficult and necessary, and that she believed it was going to lead somewhere better than where they had been. He listened without rushing to reassure her, or to provide context she had not asked for. He simply listened until she was finished, and then he said, "That kind of honesty between siblings is rare. The willingness to look clearly at something and work on it instead of around it." "I am not sure I could work around it," she said. "It would be there regardless of whether I looked directly at it." "Most people find ways not to look," he said. "I am not very good at not looking," she said. "No," he said. "I noticed that fairly early." On the 5th week, he told her about the years before he took his position, the years of preparation and expectation, and the specific weight of growing up, knowing what was coming, without having any real choice in whether you wanted it. He spoke about it carefully, feeling for the right words the way she did sometimes, when the thing she needed to say did not have an obvious shape in language. She listened the same way he listened to her. "Did you want it?" she asked, when he had finished. "The position, the role, independent of all the other things." He was quiet for a moment. She let it be quiet. "Yes and no," he said. "I wanted the work. I wanted the ability to affect things that mattered. What I wanted less was the particular shape of the life around it. The specific way that authority makes other people behave around you, which makes it very difficult to know them properly." She looked at him. "Is that what you find useful about this?" she asked. "The tea house," she meant. "This specific arrangement." "It is part of what I find useful about you," he said, and then he was quiet for a moment, as though he was considering whether to say the rest of it. "You do not behave differently in my company than you would in any other company," he said. "You are the same person in this tea house that you were in that workspace. I have not encountered that very often." She picked up her cup. "I am always the same person," she said. "I find it more efficient." "Most people find it more efficient to shift," he said. "Shifting requires keeping track of which version you are showing to whom," she said. "That is a significant organizational burden over time." He laughed. Not the short, contained version she had heard a few times before. A real one, with actual warmth in it, and she felt what she always felt when she heard that. The specific satisfaction of having produced something genuine rather than performed. She thought about it later in her room, in the quiet, with her notebook. 6 weeks of Wednesday afternoons, 12 or 13 hours of actual time in each other's company, distributed across careful conversations that had been building something she could feel the shape of without being able to name it precisely yet. She was not in a hurry to name it. She had said from the beginning that this would go at the pace it needed, and she had meant it, and the pace it needed was exactly this pace, slow enough to be real. She wrote, "I am not performing carefulness with him. I am genuinely careful because I am genuinely paying attention. Those two things look the same from the outside, but they feel entirely different from the inside. What I feel is the second one." She put the notebook down. She looked at the green curtains. She thought about the note on the nightstand, which she had not moved since she had put it there on the first night home. She was not afraid of what was developing. She was not rushing it, and she was not holding it at arm's length either. She was doing what she did with everything that mattered. She was paying attention to what was actually there rather than to what she wanted to be there, or feared being there, and she was letting the honest accumulation of accurate observation build into something she could actually trust. This was how she worked. It had always been how she worked, and it had never once failed to bring her to somewhere real. She closed her notebook. She lay down. She breathed. On a Tuesday evening in the 7th week, Celine arrived at Ilara's door, with a bag in her hand and eyes that had been crying recently, and a look on her face that Ilara recognized from 24 years of reading it, as the look Celine wore, when she had decided to do the hard thing, rather than the easier thing, that was immediately available. Elara stepped aside and let her in. They sat in the kitchen, which was the room that had always been the right room for the conversations that needed to be real. Their father made tea and brought it in, and then went to his study and closed the door with the particular tactfulness of a man who understood when his presence was not the most useful thing he could offer. Celine held her cup with both hands. She did not speak immediately. Elara waited. She had always been better at waiting than Celine was, and Celine had always known this, and had relied on it in a specific way that was partly gratitude, and partly the habit of being in close proximity to someone more patient than yourself. "I need to tell you something that is in the letter," Celine said, "but that I need to say out loud, to actually mean it properly." "All right," Elara said. "I knew something was wrong," Celine said. She said it carefully, and without looking away. Not specifically. "I did not know what Damien was planning. I genuinely did not know that. But I knew there was something uncomfortable underneath the 6 weeks, something I could feel if I pressed it, and I made the choice not to press it, because I did not want it to be uncomfortable, because I wanted it to be real." Elara looked at her. "I chose the version of the situation that was better for me," Celine said, "and you paid for that. And I need you to know that I understand that. Not in the version where I understand it enough to feel sorry and then let myself off the hook. In the version where I understand it, and I have to carry it, and I have to actually change because of it." The kitchen was quiet. "I know," Elara said. "That is all you are going to say?" Celine asked. "What else should I say?" Elara asked. "I thought you might be angry," Celine said. "I have been angry," Elara said. "I carried it for 9 days, in a room without a handle on the door. It was very useful. But I do not need to be angry at you. I need you to understand what happened, and what it cost, and what it will take to build something different between us than what we had before. And it sounds like you understand it." Celine was quiet for a moment. "What will it take?" she asked. Not defensively. Genuinely asking. "Honesty," Elara said. "When something is uncomfortable, say it is uncomfortable, rather than deciding not to press it. I would rather know what you are actually feeling than have the comfortable version of it." "I have always been worse at that than you are," Celine said. "I know," Elara said, "but you are capable of it. This conversation is evidence of that." Celine looked at her with the specific expression she wore when she was absorbing something she needed time to integrate properly. "Are you all right?" Celine asked, not the social version of the question, the real one. "Yes," Elara said. "Genuinely. I am different than I was before all of this happened. I know things about myself that I did not know before, and I know things about the situation between us that are better to know even though they were not easy to learn. But I am all right." "You went through something terrible," Celine said. "I did," Elara agreed. "And I handled it." "You always handle things," Celine said. "I am good at it," Elara said. "It is something I have worked hard to be good at." Celine looked at her for a long moment. "Can I stay tonight?" she asked. "Yes," Elara said. They talked for 3 more hours, and it was the most honest conversation they had ever had, about everything, not only about what had happened, but about the 24 years before it, about the specific shape of what it had been, to be these 2 particular twins, with these particular qualities, in this particular configuration. It was not a comfortable conversation, and it was not supposed to be. But it was real, and real was what mattered, and by the time they both ran out of things to say, it was past midnight, and the tea had been replaced twice, and the kitchen felt like it had been through something, and come out on the other side of it. Celine slept in her old room. Elara lay in her own room in the dark, and she thought about what had just happened, and what it meant for where she and her sister were going, and she felt the specific, complicated satisfaction of something genuinely difficult having been addressed, rather than avoided. She slept well. In the days that followed, she told Kale about the conversation. Not all of it, the parts that were hers to share. She told him that she and her sister had had the real conversation, the one that had been necessary, and that they had come through it into something more honest than what had been there before. He listened. When she finished, he said, "How do you feel about it?" "Tired," she said, "in the good way. The way you are tired after something that required real effort and was worth the effort. That is a specific kind of tired," he said. "The best kind," she said. He looked at her across the tea-house table. "You have been putting a great many things in order since you came home," he said. "I have been doing what I always do," she said. "Looking at what is actually there, and working with it, rather than with what I wish was there." "That sounds simple," he said. "It is simple," she said. "It is not easy. Those are different things." "What is the difference?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Simple means there are not very many steps," she said. "Easy means the steps do not cost you much. A lot of things that are simple are very expensive to do." He considered this, with the particular quality of attention he gave to things she said that he was going to keep. "I have been thinking," he said, after a moment, "about something you said in our first conversation here." She waited. "You said that you were not someone who waited to be decided about," he said. "That you made your own decisions." "I remember," she said. "I want to tell you something that is not a decision about you," he said carefully. "It is a decision about myself, and I am telling you because you are the person it is relevant to." She looked at him. "I have not," he said, "in a very long time, been in a situation where I was interested in someone in the way that I am interested in you, not as an alliance or a strategic consideration, or something that made sense, for reasons other than the straightforward one. In you specifically. In what you think, and how you think it, and the specific way you are in the world." He paused. "I am not asking you to do anything with that," he said. "I am telling you because I think you deserve to know what is actually happening from my side, so that whatever you decide it accurately." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, with the steady quality of someone who had said the thing they needed to say, and was not trying to add to it or take it back. She picked up her cup. "Thank you," she said, "for being straightforward. You specifically asked me to be," he said. "I know," she said. "I am glad you listened." She drove home that evening, with the windows of her car slightly open, letting the cool air move through. She was not in a rush to decide anything. She had said from the beginning that this would go at the pace it needed, and she had meant it, and the pace it needed was this one. But she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that what he had said had landed somewhere real, and that the honest record of her own observation over 7 weeks pointed in a direction that was not uncertain. She was simply not in a hurry. She had learned, in 9 days in a room without a handle on the door, that the right time for something was when the situation had enough clarity to move forward on real ground, rather than on the version of the ground you hoped was there. She was getting very close to that ground. She could feel it under her feet, solid and actual. She drove home. On a morning in the 9th week, Damian Cole's legal proceedings came to a formal conclusion. Ilara did not attend. She had not been asked to, and had not requested to. She had given her statement to the council representatives, who had come to the Healers' Hall 3 weeks after her return, and she had given it thoroughly and accurately, and without embellishment, in the specific, useful language of someone who had been recording what she observed from the beginning, and had the notebooks to support every detail. The council representatives had looked at her notebooks with expressions that moved progressively from skepticism to something more respectful as they worked through page after page of dated, organized, specific documentation. She had handed over copies of everything, and kept the originals. She heard about the outcome from Gwen, who had heard it from the Elder Council, through the communication channels that connected Ashwood to the broader pack law system. Damian had been found in multiple violations of pack law. He was being sent to the Northern Exile Territories, which was the appropriate response to someone who had done what he had done, and who would, in the Exile Territories, be far enough from any position of power to no longer be a relevant danger. She sat with this for a while. She was not sure what she had expected to feel. She had thought about this moment in the 9 days and in the weeks since, had wondered what it would feel like when the formal outcome arrived. What she found, when it did arrive, was something quieter than she had anticipated. Not satisfaction exactly, though there was an element of that. Not relief, though she supposed there was an element of that too. Something more like the feeling that came at the end of a long and complicated case, when the final decision had been made and documented, and there was nothing left to manage. Closed. She told Cale about it at the next Wednesday meeting. "How do you feel?" he asked. He asked this question of her more often than anyone else she knew, and he asked it with the genuine interest of someone who wanted the actual answer rather than the acceptable one. "Done," she said. It feels done. That is the right word. Is that good? He asked. Yes, she said. Done is good. Done means I can stop allocating any part of my attention to it. You have been allocating attention to it this whole time, he said. Not much, she said. But some. The small amount that comes from something being unresolved. It is a quiet drain, an open file that sits at the back of the system, taking up a bit of space. Now it can be closed. He looked at her with the expression she had come to find familiar over 9 weeks of Wednesday afternoons, the expression of someone who found the specific way she described things worth paying attention to. You think in very organized terms, he said. I am an organized person, she said. Most people would describe a legal resolution with more emotion, he said, not as an open file being closed. The emotion was 9 days ago, she said. And in the days after that, and during the conversation with my sister, I processed it then. What remains is the organizational fact that something unresolved is now resolved, and the feeling that comes with that is clean and clear, rather than complicated. And the anger? He asked. He had asked about the anger before, in an earlier conversation, and she had told him that it had been cold and useful, and that she had used it for exactly what it was needed for. He was checking to see where it was now. Filed, she said. Filed, he repeated. It did its job, she said. I do not need to carry it forward. That would be using anger as a way to stay connected to something that is over, which seems counterproductive. He was quiet for a moment. You are very deliberate, he said. I have found it is the most efficient approach, she said. For me, other people are deliberate in different ways. What is the most deliberate thing you have done recently? He asked. She looked at him. Agreed to keep meeting you here, she said, every week, when I could have decided I had enough information. He held very still for a moment. And what did you decide? He asked. I decided that the information I had was accurate as far as it went, she said, and that the most productive thing to do with accurate information is to keep gathering more of it when more is available. A pause. Is more available? He asked. Yes, she said. Quite a lot more. He looked at her across the tea-house table, in the warm afternoon light, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen from him before. Not the contained assessment she had first seen in Damien's compound, not the careful, considerate attention she had grown accustomed to over 9 weeks, something that was quieter than both of those, and more personal. I am glad, he said, that you keep coming back. So am I, she said. She drove home in the easy quiet that had become familiar to her after these meetings, the particular settled feeling of time, spent in a way that was actually worthwhile. She thought about what she had said to him, and what it had meant, and what she intended to do with it, and she was honest with herself about what it was, not the impression of something, not the weight of a dramatic situation making it seem more significant than it was. She had spent 9 weeks paying careful and specific attention to a person in the particular conditions of a tea-house table, and the ordinary conversation of people who were interested in each other. She had gathered accurate information. She had checked it against itself repeatedly. She had been completely honest with herself at every step about what she was seeing, and what she was inferring, and what the difference was between those two things. She knew what the information said. She was ready to do something with it. She called Gwen that evening. I need your opinion on something, she said. You have never needed my opinion, Gwen said. You have always needed a sounding board. Those are different things. Fine, Alara said. I need a sounding board. She talked for 20 minutes. Gwen listened without interrupting, which was one of Gwen's qualities that Alara valued most. When she was finished, Gwen was quiet for a moment. What is the question? Gwen asked. Whether I am making the decision based on what is actually there, or based on the circumstances, Alara said. You warned me not to let the circumstances do the work. I did, Gwen said. I have tried very hard to separate them, Alara said. I have spent 9 weeks specifically trying to know him as a person, rather than as the person who happened to be there at the right moment. And what do you think? Gwen asked. I think he is the kind of person I would have found interesting under any circumstances, Alara said. I think if I had met him in an ordinary way, at an ordinary time, I would have paid careful attention to him, and found what I found, and made the same assessment. Then you have your answer, Gwen said. I thought you might want to discuss it more, Alara said. You do not need me to discuss it, Gwen said. You needed to hear yourself say it out loud, to someone who would hold you accountable if it was not true. I held you accountable. It was true. Alara held the phone for a moment. Thank you, she said. Go to sleep, Gwen said. You have a full patient list tomorrow, and you do your best work when you are rested. She went to sleep. In the morning, she wrote a short note and gave it to the royal courier, who had by this point become a familiar presence in the area of the healer's hall, and who accepted the note with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this long enough to find it ordinary. The note said, I would like to speak with you outside of the tea house, somewhere that you chose rather than me, so that I can see a different context, this week if possible. The response came back the same afternoon. Tomorrow evening. I know a place. 7 o'clock. She told her father she would be out for dinner. He looked at her with the specific quality of attention that fathers directed at daughters who were telling them something without saying it, and he nodded, and said to have a good time, and ask no questions. She wore something different this time. Not the gray dress, a dark blue that she liked for its simplicity, and that she had bought 2 weeks ago without quite knowing what she was buying it for. She arrived at 7. The place he had chosen was a small restaurant she had not been to before, in a part of the territory she knew but did not visit often. It was not a grand restaurant. It was the kind of place with tables that had been used for many years, and a menu that changed by season, and a warmth in the room that came from the specific combination of good light and people having real conversations at close distances. He was already there. She stopped in the doorway for a moment. He was sitting at a table near the window. Not the most strategically positioned table in the room, just a good table with a view of the street and enough light to see properly. He was reading something on a small card, probably the menu, with the focused attention he brought to everything. He had not seen her yet. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment, and she was honest with herself about what she felt, which was the particular warm clarity of someone who has done all the necessary work and arrived at a place they wanted to be. Then she walked across the room and sat down across from him, and he looked up, and the expression on his face when he saw her was worth everything the past 10 weeks had cost. You chose well, she said. I was hoping you would think so, he said. I think so, she said. They ordered, they talked, they ate. It was, again, not a dramatic evening. Nothing extraordinary happened during it, and it was the best evening she had spent in as long as she could clearly remember, because it was completely ordinary in all the ways that mattered. 2 people at a table, having a real conversation, in a restaurant that smelled like good food, and had been used by many people over many years, and did not require any performance from either of them. At the end of the evening, standing outside on the street in the cool night air, he looked at her in the light from the restaurant window. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes, she said. What would it look like, he said carefully, if this became something more than Wednesday afternoons and occasional dinners? She looked at him. She had thought about this, because she thought carefully about things that mattered before she was asked to speak about them. It would look like this, she said, exactly this, but more of it. I would not change the pace, or the honesty, or the way we have been doing this. I would just stop calling it careful investigation, and start calling it what it is. What is it? He asked. She looked at him steadily. She looked at him steadily. Something I chose, she said, something I am choosing right now, with full information and complete clarity. Not because of anything that happened before, or because of the circumstances, or because you happen to be the Alpha King, because of who you actually are, which I have spent 9 weeks finding out on purpose. He was quiet for a moment. I chose it too, he said, if that matters to say. It matters, she said. The street was quiet around them. The restaurant light was warm behind the glass. So, she said, next Wednesday. Next Wednesday, he said, and also before that, if you are willing. I am willing, she said. She walked to her car. She drove home. She was smiling by the time she got there, which was not something she did privately very often, and she did not try to stop it. The formal bonding ceremony took place on a morning in late spring, 6 months after Alara had sat at a work table in a compound that was not hers, and written in a notebook by the light of a window that looked east. She had been asked, through the Royal Protocol Office, what kind of ceremony she wanted, The question had been delivered with the very careful diplomatic phrasing of people who were accustomed to asking it of someone for whom the answer was constrained by expectations and tradition, and who were not entirely sure what to do with someone who answered it directly and specifically. She had answered it directly and specifically. She wanted it small, she wanted it at dawn. She wanted it outdoors, in something growing rather than something built, because she had spent enough time in enclosed spaces recently, and she associated enclosed spaces with a specific period that she was not interested in commemorating. She wanted it witnessed by the people who were genuinely part of her life, rather than by people whose attendance was protocol. And she wanted to speak her own words, rather than the standard ceremonial text, because the standard ceremonial text had been written by people who did not know her, and she had words of her own that were more accurate. The protocol office had processed this with expressions she found genuinely amusing, and then had produced exactly what she asked for. The garden behind the royal residential building was smaller than most of the formal spaces on the grounds. It had been planted generations ago, and had been tended consistently enough that everything in it had grown to a scale that made it feel like somewhere real, rather than somewhere designed to impress. There were fruit trees at the perimeter, and several kinds of flowering plants she could name professionally, and a stone path that had been laid irregularly, the way paths were laid when they followed where feet already went, rather than where a plan said they should go. She stood at the edge of the path and looked at the garden in the gray pre-light, and she breathed the morning air, which was cool and carried the smell of the flowering things and the damp earth, and, very faintly, the first warmth of the approaching sun. She was not nervous. She had spent 6 months arriving at this morning through an honest and careful process, and she was not nervous about any part of it. She was wearing a dress the color of early morning light, pale and without embellishment, which she had chosen because it was the most accurate representation of what she wanted the morning to feel like, not a performance, simply the thing itself. Celine arrived next. She came through the garden gate in the gray light, with her hair pinned up in the particular way she pinned it when she was trying to look composed and wanted the effort to be invisible, and she stopped when she saw Alara, and looked at her the way she had been learning to look at her since their midnight kitchen conversation, with the honest attention of someone working to see clearly, rather than to see what she expected. "You look exactly right," Celine said. "Thank you," Alara said. Celine came and stood beside her. They were quiet together for a moment, which was a different kind of quiet than the quiet they had shared for most of their lives. Not the comfortable quiet of things unsaid, that both people had decided not to say. The quiet of people who had said the difficult things, and were now standing on the other side of them. "Are you happy?" Celine asked. "Yes," Alara said. "Genuinely." "I know," Celine said. "I can see it. You look like yourself, but more." Alara thought about this. "More what?" she asked. Celine looked at her. "More like yourself," she said. "Like all of it. Arrived at the same place at the same time." Alara pressed her fingers briefly to her sister's arm. Others arrived. Gwen came and stood at the edge of the garden path, and looked at the setup with the expression she wore when something met her standards, which was the expression of someone who was not going to say so out loud. Her father came and stood behind Alara for a moment, with his hands on her shoulders, and his chin briefly pressed to the top of her head, and she felt the whole weight of 24 years of him in it. Nora had made the trip from the Coldwater Territory 2 days earlier, which had involved a complex set of arrangements that Alara had helped facilitate, and which Nora had accepted with the particular combination of gratitude and determination that had been increasingly characteristic of her since she had begun working at the Ashwood Healers' Hall 3 months ago. She stood near the back of the small gathering, with the bright and careful look of someone who was understanding that the thing she had quietly helped to make possible had become this morning. Claire was there, with her husband and her 3-month-old daughter, who slept through the entire ceremony wrapped against her mother's chest. Alara had been present at the delivery, and had held the baby first after the midwife, and the look on Claire's face when Alara had looked up from the baby to her had been the specific look of trust fulfilled that was, in Alara's considered opinion, one of the best things a healer ever got to witness. The elder who presided was a woman named Ruth, who had officiated at pack ceremonies for 30 years, and who had listened to Alara's specific and detailed requests with the sharp attention of someone who had heard many variations on the same ceremonial template, and found this one genuinely interesting. When the time came, Ruth read the short formal section that was required by law. the legal language that established what was being recorded and who was witnessing it. The official part, that was official, because it needed to be, and that everyone present understood, was not the part that was going to matter. Then she looked at Alara. Alara turned to face Kale. He was wearing something simple and dark and was standing in the early morning light with the quality she had first noticed in Damien's compound yard, the quality she now knew well enough to understand what it was. Not authority exactly, though there was that. The quality of someone who had arrived at this morning through their own careful and honest process, and was completely present in it. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her across the tea-house table on their first Wednesday, the way she had first seen in the workspace doorway, the way that saw the specific person rather than the surface of her. She had been composing her words for 3 weeks, which was not because they were difficult to say, but because she wanted them to be accurate. She had drafted them the way she drafted clinical documentation, looking at each word to make sure it said what she meant, and not the version of what she meant that was easier or more expected. She said them now. She told him that she had spent 24 years being the twin that people looked past on their way to the one they were looking for, and that she had built something real in that space that had nothing to do with being seen and everything to do with the work itself. She told him that what she chose now was not the rescue of being chosen by someone with power, because she had never been waiting for rescue, and if he had tried to offer it to her she would have politely declined it. What she chose was him, specifically, for the specific reasons she had spent 6 months finding out through honest attention, and those reasons were accurate, and were not going to change, because she had checked them carefully, and continued to check them, and they were consistently real. She told him that she was not a person who made promises about the future, because the future was genuinely unknown, and making promises about it was a form of overconfidence she had always found imprecise. What she could promise was what she intended to do, which was to keep paying attention, and keep being honest, and keep choosing this, with the same care she brought to everything that mattered to her, which was considerable. She had told him, before today, what she intended to say. He had listened to the whole thing, and then been quiet for a moment, and then said, "That is the most accurate thing I have ever heard at a ceremony." She had said, "That is what I was aiming for." He had said, "What do you want me to say?" She had said, "What is true?" He had thought about it for several days, and then told her what he had come to, and she had listened, and it was true. He said it now. He said that he had been the Alpha King since he was old enough to understand what that meant, and that the position had shaped his life in ways he had not always chosen and could not always name, and that the thing the position had most consistently cost him was the ability to know whether the people around him were responding to him or to what he represented. He said that she had, from the first moment he had seen her, responded entirely to him, in a workspace in a compound, where she was being held by someone else, with no reason to be generous to anyone from his world, and very good reasons not to be. He said that this had been the first piece of evidence, and that the evidence had continued to accumulate over 6 months of Wednesday afternoons, and honest conversation, and that what he knew now was accurate in the way that things built from real evidence were accurate, which was the most reliable kind. He said that he had never been interested in being good at his position until he had something specific to be good at it for. The garden was very quiet. Ruth made the record. She did it without ceremony, beyond what was required, which was exactly right. Afterward, in the garden in the early morning light, the small group of people who had gathered stood together while the sun finished rising and turned everything warm and gold, and Alara stood with Kale's hand in hers, and her sister on her left, and Gwen somewhere slightly behind her saying nothing, which was Gwen's most expressive form of approval, and her father looking at her the way he had looked at her at the edge of the courtyard on the worst night, but opposite. Claire's baby woke up and made a small, decisive sound. Everyone laughed, including Alara, including Kale, and the laughter was the easy kind, unguarded and warm and entirely real. Later, after the others had gone and the garden had returned to its ordinary morning quiet, Alara stood at the edge of the stone path for a moment alone, not quite alone. Kale was a few feet away, speaking with her father. She looked at the garden in the morning light, the fruit trees, the flowering things she could name, the path that had been laid where feet already went. She thought about a notebook and a room without a handle on the door, and the cold, useful anger that had done exactly what it was needed to do. She thought about Nora's hands taking a folded piece of paper in a corridor, and the specific courage that had taken for both of them. She thought about the note under the door that she still had, in the same drawer where she kept her most important notebooks. She thought about all the things you could not know about yourself until the right situation made them visible, and about the particular gift of difficult situations, which was that they showed you clearly what you were made of, when you had no room left to be something easier. She had learned what she was made of. She was satisfied with it. Cale came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the garden. "That things go at the pace they need to go," she said, "and that this one went at exactly the right pace." He looked at the garden beside her. "Yes," he said, "it did." The sun was fully up now, warm and clear, laying gold across the garden path and the flowering things, and the stone that had been worn smooth by years of feet, going exactly where they meant to go. She breathed. She was home.